I now want to go into some questions, and we're going to start with kind of a sticky wicket. Let's say I'm a municipality, a rail operator, a state government, and I want to build a new station. What are the challenges to that? What are the opportunities? Who do I need to make sure I have at the table for that? And that can be any three of our panelists.
I can jump in, and I bet that we'll all have a comment. Working? Okay, perfect. Well, agreeing that there will be train service there is always a great start. And even Amtrak, while we operate the trains, we're not the decision maker about where the trains stop. Depending on how that train service is funded, there's federal funding, state funding, or other. So I think there's a big habit to jump into conversations about capital funding a new train station. And then you hear in the news all the time, like, oh, City X is going to build a $500 million new train station. And you're like, when is the train going to start at that station once it's built? And they're like, oh, well, we haven't figured out the operating funding yet for that train. So I always recommend start with the operations and then go to capital.
Yeah, I think I just made reference to what I said earlier about the Calgary example. They had a train station which disappeared. They have a bunch of train lines. They've got a bunch of LRT lines. They're looking at even more services. So they're sort of drawing a spot on the map. And I think reserving a spot can be as valuable as finding a spot. And because if it's too late and someone's built a tower or there's a mall there, then you're maybe going to a secondary location. So,
Meredith, would you like to weigh in? Oh, you're muted. Not quite yet.
While we're working on Meredith, I think another. Oh, go ahead and let's hear it, Meredith.
It is not an area of great expertise of mine, although it's been an area of concern because as a former member of the Charlottesville City Council, I'm very familiar with the dynamics of when an Amtrak station that's very busy, and I might add that our little community had 201,000 passengers at our historic, very small station last year. It's a pretty active station, and it's privately owned, and there hasn't been there has not been much investment in the station for the last 20 years. And so I think that anything that Amtrak can do to support communities like ours with expertise and advice and help us guide our way to improving. That station was last improved under, remember Ice-T, an old Ice-T grant in 1997. And it hasn't really had much change since then. And the owner gets a lot of revenue from the parking. That's his big profit source, is the parking. So I just speak more from personal station experience. It's a station that's 5 minutes away from my house, and I love it. It's gorgeous. It's a little historic station, but it's completely inadequate, and we just can't seem to break through all the barriers to public ownership and the financing for things that would help that. So any advice you could give, Stephen, would be appreciated. Maybe I'll bring you here and we can talk about it over lunch someday, or with our.
I love Meredith, that plug that you gave for Amtrak. In my role is almost business development and marketing as much as it is, negotiating deals. And Tom Lang, when we first started talking about this event at PNWER, thanks so much for the invite. I mentioned that we're trying to tell all communities, come and talk to us if you have an idea. You can see that, we churn out numbers really, really fast and kind of can help you plan really rapidly and give you this advice so we can start building a coalition.
Good, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for that. This next question is a how the sausage gets made question. I love how the sausage gets made question. What is the optimal government structure for expanding a regional rail network or service? Is it a public-private partnership? Is it an interstate compact? Is it a separate state agency for rail and transit? Ooh, sorry, that's a favorite of mine. Meredith, I'm wondering if you'd like to start with this one.
Okay, public-private partnerships are, in at least the Virginia experience, are primarily with either government agencies outside of the state or with the railroads, the host railroads. We have a very good experience working with host railroads, and it's been a great advance for Virginia for example, to help the railroads divest themselves of underutilized assets, which the public sector is more than happy to acquire in order to promote our public uh, rail offerings, and have often done that and will continue to do that. So I would say that that's part of the making of the sausage, is keeping up good relationships with your host railroads and making sure that your projects are just as beneficial to the host railroad as they are to the public sector. And I think that's a trick. That's not always an easy thing to do, and I've sometimes been on the public side of some of those negotiations, and it is a matter of, first of all, making it a good business decision for the host railroad, and secondly, using public resources where necessary to add the capacity for their improvements, their infrastructure improvements that the public can fund to add capacity to those tracks, in particular to host your passenger rail. And I don't, I think that's where a large part of the funds that Virginia has spent on passenger rail have gone, is in those partnerships. But that was the initial function of the Rail Enhancement Fund. It was limited to projects for the freight railroads, but when PREA was adopted at the federal level, and the potential for public-private partnerships for new routes was opened, it became a very handy tool for us for using for those track improvements to enhance the capacity and eliminate the barriers to hosting passenger rail. So that's part of the sausage. I think the other part of the sausage for us has been a lot of public innovation in terms of public rail policy, and that's a whole different topic. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Keeps your host railroads happy. Good
Yes.
advice all around.
Yes.
David or Stephen, do you have any thoughts on this? And again, the question is, what is the optimal government structure for expanding a rail service or network?
Yeah, it's a much more complicated question than it sounds quite simple. It depends, I think, on the rail, on the service, what your purpose is. It becomes more difficult to expand some networks than others, depending on your business model. And sometimes it's not very clear what the business model is. So, for example, Via Rail, which you're not very familiar with, maybe a lot of you, is really three businesses in one. It has a cross-Canada Canadian railway, which people are maybe aware of, is quite famous. In the summer, it's packed. They charge a premium. The Via Rail actually makes a lot of money in the summer. But then they run it in the wintertime, and for whatever reason, people don't like to go across Canada in the wintertime, and it's very, very empty, and they sort of lose all the money that they made in the summer. Then it also has another business, which is essential services. There's some remote regions of Canada that they have rail going, and that if you didn't have the rail there, there would be no services available. So that's not really a business model in some ways. It's just a service provision. And then the one that I talked about a little before, between Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, That is where 90% of Via Rail's traffic is very similar to Amtrak, has some corridors where it's a lot of work. That's a very viable business model in terms of the volume and the revenue. But another way of looking at business models is, can you pay for your capital? Are you EBITDA positive? And for a lot of the organizations, the train stations are in disrepair. The engines are up to a safety standard, but maybe should be refreshed. The travel kit is quite low. So can you actually use that business to refresh your capital? And unfortunately, a lot of time that requires the injection of capital from the government. So there's a lot of ways to look at business models and how sustainable they are, maybe year to year or over cover the cost of capital. That's a completely different thing.
Fantastic. This next one I'm going to give a little background for. So in Aorta's rail advocacy, something that we come across a lot is perceptions about, inaccurate perceptions about rail. Something I get a lot, even from policymakers, is rail, why does it really matter? Right? It's something that's a little early 20th century to a lot of people. And I think we've had some moments where the public has almost been forced to confront how important rail is to the economy. We've had several points in the last 15 years where we've almost had a railroad strike. And as disastrous as to the economy as that would have been, I think there was a part of me that was secretly hoping it would occur, so people would wake up and realize exactly what they're talking about when they say that. Obviously, for one reason or another, that hasn't occurred, that hasn't happened. And as such, I think the public is given a great disservice by not realizing how important rail is in their life. So my question is, what can we do to get policymakers and the public to understand the role, the importance, and crucially, the potential of rail in the 21st century?
Wow, that was a loaded question.
Right? I know it's a big one. It's not an easy one.
Lots of tripping hazards as well.
I know, especially for someone at Amtrak, but please tackle it if you can.
I'll answer it from my perspective of my job rather than like the many sort of macro layers that you're talking about. But getting people on the trains, having full trains, I think is the best argument for having more trains. And when stations don't have a dense, vibrant, mixed-use environment around it, that really drives ridership because of the amount of convenience, that then makes it really hard to get people onto the train because we're asking them to drive or to take the bus or other form. And so that's my goal, is if we can get every single one of our stations to have, you know, a reasonable density for the community that they're in, but it's fully built out. Again, that argument of rail service as sort of the, you know, heart of the local economy, I think will get elevated.
I think that makes a lot of sense, really tying together the nature of the feedback between land use and transportation. I think that's a very point well taken. David, do you have an idea? Oh, sure. Meredith, do you have an idea? And again, it's how do we get policymakers and the public to understand the role, importance, and potential of rail in the 21st century?
So you're asking me. I've heard David, but I think you're asking me. You know, that is a multi-layered question. When I first started my advocacy work about 30 years ago, it was a brick wall when approaching most elected officials who would just simply dismiss rail as part of the past and something that was not going to survive. And they would say nobody rides the trains anymore, which was probably largely true at that time. But I think things have greatly changed, and even some of the more resistant public officials, since you mentioned how to approach them and how to talk to them, are recognizing that our transportation policies in this country, having emphasized highways and roads for so long, has probably been gone in the wrong direction in terms of sustainability, in terms of the environment, and in terms of safety. So many ways that it's unsustainable. And on the other hand, if they get on a train, which is one of the reasons that we took 32 of them to Portland, was to ride the Cascades, to ride the TriMet system, to see how it works, how it interacts with transit and with your communities and the benefits that it has. Seeing and riding can really be believing. And I do agree that when people get on a train and take the train, for example, the train to Washington from either one of our corridors in Virginia, they are just so much better and easier and really shorter trips with competitive trip times to Washington, D.C. in the Northeast Corridor. When people discover that, it is a done deal. They're not going to drive again. They get on those trains and they love it. I also think that they all saw that trains require um, support, they require public subsidies, whereas highways do not. I think I tried to break through that a little bit in my comments because, frankly, our fuel taxes are not paying for themselves, and trains are contributing. It's not a question of the train, whether the train makes a profit or not. You always hear that too from a lot of elected officials. Well, they require subsidies, they don't make a profit. Amtrak doesn't make a profit. Okay, but that was never the purpose of Amtrak. And what it's not a question of whether the train makes a profit, but who's deriving the economic benefits from it. And those are your communities. And I have been in this a situation now where many people, many communities are actually competing with each other in Virginia for new rail service or extended rail service. They want to be on those routes and they know it's because it's good for their community economically and it helps them with their downtown revitalization. It gives mobility to their citizens and people access to jobs and health care, and they get that. They're the ones who get it. And those trains that serve our state are powerful economic engines, especially for smaller communities. So I think it's a question of making the arguments because the arguments are there. We have all the arguments on our side, and they are there. It's just a question of mobilizing them and getting them across. So that's sort of that's my advice. We have a lot going for us in the rail community. We just need to know how to communicate it.
Thank you so much. David, do you have any thoughts?
Well, there's a couple of things, or one thing I think, building on what Meredith and Stephen both said, that getting on the train is the solution. But what kind of trains do we have? I think I've traveled on high-speed rail in Asia and Europe, and I think a lot of people here have. So we know what a world-class train experience is. And it hasn't happened in North America for a lot of various reasons. And there's a potential there. And I think as the service levels start to increase in various pockets, there's some corridors that are very successful now. That's going to sort of change the message about what the train experience is like. And that's going to sort of spread out, say, well, why can't we be like this corridor, that corridor? A lot of the success now is based upon economic efficiency. But as you look at a quality experience, maybe I don't want to get too much into the high-speed rail projects around. There's some private sector ones, but maybe one or two of them will sort of light up everyone's imagination and show what North America can do. I think that will also go a long way to getting people more interested. So.
Right.
Well, I see we only have 8 minutes left, so we're going to have time for one final question. And if Stephen, if you thought the last question was a little thorny for a federal employee, you're going to love this one. What do you see happening at the local and federal level to support rail investment, and how is rail navigating the current federal atmosphere?
Yeah, again, I think what I presented to you today was no matter what, if you're a state or city or even at the federal level, right now, everyone's trying to figure out how to do more with the same or less money. And that's where looking at these public-private partnerships and figuring out, not all projects are a good P3. And so you have to find the ones where there is some leverage that can be created and sort of monetized for it to become more. accretive to the project that you're talking about. So almost every project should be taking this exercise of like, is a P3 right for me? Many projects, the answer is going to be no. But the exciting thing about rail lines and train stations is it's probably the ones where there's the most, commercial opportunity when you start talking about mixes of uses. So that would be my answer, is do more with less by being more creative.
Thanks. Maybe I'll twist your question around a little bit, Xavier. I think actually the local and regional governments have done the right thing. You look at maybe back in the 60s or 70s, it was all about cars and about freeways, and we had airlines and then jammed up, waiting in the airport, waiting in to get to taxiways. That whole industry went through a crisis point. But in the meantime, all kinds of municipalities have brought light rail into their cities. We've got more and more. Those are ideal feeders or complementary to a rail system. So in some ways, the table is set all the way across North America for intercity rail because we have a system that really coordinates very well with them. So I think it's more at the federal level, federal governments have to step up and take advantage of all this local infrastructure to create the efficiencies that are there. I think that's where the real challenge is.
Meredith, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm not a government employee, so I feel a little freer. However, I think that we are not quite there in terms of understanding what this administration's priorities are going to be for rail. I think it's a little unclear, but it's not necessarily a point of view that won't support rail. In fact, I mentioned that the federal state partnership grant program has been funded at $5 billion, and they're now looking for applications for applicants, and they're using money left over that wasn't spent in the Biden administration, and they're looking for 2025 appropriations, and also certainly we have mixed feelings about this. They're repurposing some of the California high-speed rail money into that program. But the point is that they are supporting the federal program for federal state partnerships with $5 billion of more or less new money for the program. And I take that as a good sign. I take the recent settlements with the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern on preference, where the Department of Justice and the Surface Transportation Board have made decisions requiring the host railroads, to settle with Amtrak and with the Crescent as far as delivering our trains on time and giving them preference over freight. And those were very significant decisions and actions by this administration. So I think that frankly the jury's out on all that, but I'm not necessarily pessimistic. And we do have reauthorization coming up, and I think that's going to tell a lot of tales, but I don't think it's going to happen soon, both because of the shutdown and because these things just take time. But we will see. I think there's also pretty strong evidence that there's a willingness on the administration side to continue some of the grant programs like CRISI and grade crossings and safety and so forth, pretty much at IIJA levels, if not possibly even higher. So I have to say that the jury's out. Let's just say that, but it's not necessarily a situation that won't do some favoring towards rail.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And then Stephen, in our final 3 minutes, do you think you can answer this question? How do you sell the vision of density and economic benefits in smaller communities?
Yeah, I probably alluded to it in my slide, so this might sound repetitive, but you got to prioritize what you want. When you go into these meetings, there's somebody who's going to want everything, either a park or school or, bicycle pedestrian improvements, traffic, relief projects. So a real estate project can't finance it all. And so you've got to pick what is your, first order priority and get the project built. Because if you load it up with so much demands that the project never occurs, you're talking about, years to decades of delay, which is, every year for a 250 unit housing building, it's almost $1 million of city taxes. So you could end up getting all of those community benefits that are desired if you just let the project get built and then figure out how to deploy that tax revenue based on, that priority or sort of staging order.
Fantastic answer. Well, thank you so much for our panelists, David Hoff of Ledcor, Steven Segerlin of Amtrak, and Meredith Richards of the Rail Passenger Association. Thank you so much to all you three. Fantastic job. So informative. Appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.